I was 70 years old when I finally understood that I had spent my entire life in the wrong room. It was Christmas Day, and the house smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon and pine needles from the tree we'd decorated 2 weeks earlier. Outside, the Chicago snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the streets in that kind of silence that only winter can bring. Inside, my home was loud with laughter, clinking glasses, and the warm chaos of family gathered together. Except I wasn't part of it. I stood in the kitchen, my hands red and aching from washing dishes, my back screaming from hours of standing. Through the doorway, I could see them all in the living room. My daughter, Morella, her husband, and their 2 teenage children. My son, Garrett, and his wife. My youngest, Simone, who had flown in from Seattle with her boyfriend. They were toasting, laughing, telling stories I couldn't quite hear over the running water. I had cooked everything. The turkey, the stuffing, the green bean casserole, the mashed potatoes, the cranberry sauce from scratch. I'd baked 3 pies. I'd set the table with my grandmother's china, the one I only used for special occasions. I'd spent 3 days preparing, shopping, cleaning, making sure everything was perfect. And when it was time to sit down and eat, I had been the one serving. I had filled their plates, poured their wine, brought out dish after dish while they ate and talked and celebrated. I had smiled, because that's what I always did. I had told myself it was fine, that this was my role, that I was happy to do it. But when the meal was over and I'd started clearing the table, thinking maybe now I could sit down and join them, Morella had looked at me with that same expression she'd worn since she was a teenager, that look that said I was being inconvenient. She'd said, her voice light and dismissive, "Mom, someone has to clean up. You know how it is." And just like that, I had been dismissed, sent back to the kitchen while they moved to the living room with their desserts and their laughter. I stood there now, at 70 years old, my hands in soapy water, staring out the window at the falling snow, and I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in decades. I felt invisible. Chapter 2. The woman I used to be. I hadn't always been the woman in the kitchen. Once, a lifetime ago, I had been Delilah Whitmore, a girl with dreams bigger than the small Indiana town I grew up in. I'd wanted to be a teacher. I'd gotten a scholarship to a state college, one of the first in my family to go. I'd studied literature and education, spent my evenings reading poetry in coffee shops, imagining a life where I'd inspire young minds and write on weekends. Then I met Theodore Winters. He was handsome, charming, 3 years older than me, and already working as an accountant. He'd swept me off my feet with promises of a good life, stability, a home of our own. We married when I was 22, and I'd dropped out of college in my final year because he'd said we needed to save money, that I could always go back later. Later never came. By 24, I had Morella. By 27, Garrett. By 30, Simone. Theodore worked long hours, and I stayed home, because that's what wives did back then. That's what was expected. I told myself I was building something important. A family. A home. A foundation for my children's futures. Theodore died when I was 55. A heart attack in his office. Sudden and devastating. The grief had nearly killed me, but I'd survived. I'd had to. The kids still needed me, even though they were adults by then. I'd thrown myself into being useful. I babysat grandchildren. I hosted every holiday. I made sure everyone felt welcome, loved, cared for. I told myself this was enough, that this was what it meant to be a mother, a grandmother. But standing in that kitchen on Christmas night, I realized something terrible. I had given them everything, and somewhere along the way, they had learned to expect it. They had learned to take without giving back, and I had taught them that this was acceptable, because I had never asked for anything different. Chapter 3. The morning after. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Everyone had left by 10, hugging me quickly on their way out, thanking me for the lovely meal, before disappearing into the snowy night. No one had offered to help clean up. I'd stayed in the kitchen until midnight, washing dishes, putting away leftovers, sweeping the floor. When I finally went to bed, my hands were raw, and my heart was heavy. I woke up at dawn, like I always did. The house was silent. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the morning was that particular kind of bright that only happens after a fresh snowfall. Everything looked clean, pristine, untouched. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd fed my children breakfast for decades, where I'd helped with homework and hosted birthday parties and listened to teenage heartbreak. And I made a decision. I pulled out a notepad and pen, the kind I used for grocery lists, and I started writing. Not a grocery list this time. Something else. A plan. A boundary. A line in the sand. I was 70 years old, and I was not going to spend whatever years I had left being invisible in my own home. Chapter 4. The list. My list was simple, but writing it down felt revolutionary. Things that will change. 1. I will no longer host every holiday. 2. I will no longer cook large meals without help. 3. I will no longer clean up alone. 4. I will ask for what I need, and if I don't receive it, I will not pretend everything is fine. 5. I will use my time and energy for myself. I stared at the words for a long time. They felt radical, selfish, even. But then I thought about Christmas night, about standing alone in that kitchen while my family laughed without me, and I realized that taking care of myself wasn't selfish at all. It was survival. That morning, I called Mirella. She answered on the third ring, her voice cheerful and distracted, like she was doing something else while talking to me. "Hi, Mom. What's up?" I took a deep breath and said the words I'd rehearsed in my head all morning. "Mirella, I need to talk to you about something important." There was a pause, then a sigh. I could almost see her rolling her eyes through the phone. "Mom, is this about Christmas? I know you were tired, but that's just how holidays are. Everyone gets tired." "No," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "And this is about more than being tired. I need you to listen to me." Another pause. This one felt different. Maybe she heard something in my voice that made her pay attention. "Okay," she said slowly. "I'm listening. I love you," I started, because that was true and important. I love all of you, but I can't keep doing this. I can't keep hosting holidays and cooking everything and cleaning up alone while everyone else celebrates without me. I'm 70 years old, Mirella. I'm tired, and I feel invisible. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she said, her voice cold, "So what? You're saying we're ungrateful. After everything you've done, you're going to throw that in our faces." My heart sank, but I pressed on. "I'm not saying you're ungrateful. I'm saying I need things to change. I need help. I need to be part of the celebration, not just the person who makes it happen." "Fine," she snapped. "Next year, we'll order takeout. Problem solved." And she hung up. I sat there, staring at my phone, feeling like I'd been slapped. Contrabuan. Chapter 5. The Rift. The days after that phone call were some of the loneliest of my life. Mirella didn't call back. When I tried to reach her, she sent short, cold text messages. "Busy with work. Kids have activities. Talk later." Later never came. Garrett was more diplomatic when I called him. He listened, made sympathetic noises, and then said, "Mom, you know how Mirella is. She'll calm down. Just give her time." But he didn't offer to help either. He didn't say, "You're right, we should have done more." He just smoothed things over, like he always did, trying to keep everyone happy without actually addressing the problem. Simone was the only one who seemed to understand, at least a little. "Mom, I get it," she said, when I explained what had happened. "You've been carrying all of us for a long time, but you have to understand. This is going to be hard for them to hear. They're used to you being a certain way. So I'm supposed to just keep being that way?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. "No," she said gently, "but you have to be patient. Change is hard for everyone." I wanted to scream that I'd been patient my entire life, that I'd been patient when Theodore worked late, and I raised the kids alone, that I'd been patient when they forgot my birthday, or canceled plans at the last minute, that I'd been patient through decades of putting everyone else first. But I didn't say that. I just thanked her and hung up. Chapter 6. The Empty Nest. January came, and with it, a silence I hadn't anticipated. No one called. No one visited. The house, which had always felt full even when I was alone, now felt cavernous and cold. I went through my days in a kind of fog, cooking meals for one, watching television without really seeing it, going to bed early because there was nothing else to do. I thought about calling them, apologizing, taking it all back. It would be so easy. I could say I'd overreacted, that I was just tired, that everything was fine. They'd forgive me, and things would go back to normal. But then I'd remember Christmas night. I'd remember standing in that kitchen, invisible and alone, and I'd know that going back wasn't an option. One cold afternoon, I was sitting in my living room, staring out at the snow-covered street, when I heard a knock at the door. It was my neighbor, Florence Calloway, a woman about my age who I'd known for 20 years but never gotten particularly close to. She stood on my porch holding a casserole dish, her face red from the cold. "Delilah," she said, her voice warm. "I haven't seen you out and about lately. Thought I'd check on you." I almost cried right there. Instead, I invited her in, made tea, and we sat in my kitchen talking. She told me about her own children, who lived across the country and rarely visited. She told me about her late husband, who died 10 years ago, and how she'd had to learn to build a life for herself that didn't revolve around taking care of other people. "It's the hardest thing," she said, stirring her tea. "Realizing that the people you've sacrificed everything for don't always see that sacrifice. They just see what they've always seen. And sometimes, they don't want it to change because change is uncomfortable." I nodded, tears streaming down my face, because she understood. She saw me in a way my own children didn't. "What did you do?" I asked. She smiled, sad but knowing. "I learned to live for myself. I joined a book club. I started volunteering at the library. I made friends. I built a life that was mine, not just an extension of everyone else's needs." It sounded terrifying and liberating. Chapter 7. Small Steps Forward. I started small. I joined Florence's book club. It met every other Tuesday at the local library, a group of 8 women, most of them my age or older, all of them eager to talk about literature and life over coffee and cookies. It felt strange at first, sitting in a circle, talking about novels and characters instead of grandchildren and recipes. But it also felt good. No one expected me to serve them. No one dismissed what I had to say. We were equals. All of us there because we wanted to be, not because we had to be. I started volunteering at a soup kitchen downtown, ladling out meals to people who needed them, people who thanked me and looked me in the eye and saw me as a person, not just a pair of hands. I took a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. I was terrible at it, but it didn't matter. I was doing something for myself, something that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or expectations. Slowly, the fog started to lift. I started to feel like Delilah again, not just Mom or Grandma, but me. But the silence from my children continued. Chapter 8. The Phone Call. It was mid-February when Garrett finally called. "Mom," he said, his voice careful. "Yeah, how are you?" "I'm fine," I said, and for the first time in months, it was true. "Look," he continued, "Morella's birthday's coming up. We're planning a family dinner. We'd really like you to be there." My heart twisted. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to grab at this olive branch and hold on tight. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger these past weeks, hesitated. "Where's the dinner?" I asked. "At Morella's place. Nothing fancy, just family." "And who's cooking?" There was a pause. "Well, Morella was hoping you might make your lasagna. You know how much she loves it." There it was. The expectation. The assumption that I would fall back into my old role without question. "Garrett," I said slowly, "I'll come to the dinner, but I'm not cooking. If Morella wants lasagna, she can make it herself or order it. I'll bring a bottle of wine and a card." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, come on, don't be like this." "Like what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Difficult. You know what I mean." The word hit me like a punch. Difficult. Because setting a boundary made me difficult. Because asking not to be taken for granted made me difficult. "I'm not being difficult," I said, my voice steady. "I'm being clear about what I'm willing to do. I love Morella. I'll celebrate with her, but I'm not going back to being invisible." He sighed, frustrated. "Fine. I'll tell her." And he hung up. Chapter 9. The Birthday Dinner. I almost didn't go to Morella's birthday dinner. The morning of, I stood in front of my closet, staring at my clothes, trying to decide what to wear to an event where I wasn't sure I'd be welcome. In the end, I chose a simple navy dress, something that made me feel put together without trying too hard. I bought an expensive bottle of red wine and a card with a heartfelt message about love and family. I practiced what I'd say if someone confronted me, rehearsing boundaries and calm responses. When I arrived at Morella's house in the suburbs, the driveway was full of cars. I parked on the street and walked up to the door, my heart pounding. Garrett answered, giving me a quick, awkward hug before ushering me inside. The house was warm and loud, filled with the smell of pizza and the sound of children playing. I saw Morella in the kitchen, pulling plates from a cabinet. She looked up when I walked in, her face carefully neutral. "Hi, Mom," she said. "Hi, sweetheart. Happy birthday." I handed her the wine and the card. She took them, glanced at the wine label, and nodded. "Thanks. You can put your coat in the guest room." No hug, no warmth, just cool politeness. I swallowed the hurt and did as she suggested. The dinner itself was painfully awkward. We ate pizza around Morella's dining table, the conversation stilted and careful. No one mentioned Christmas. No one mentioned our fight. Everyone pretended everything was normal, even though the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I tried to engage, asking my grandchildren about school, complimenting Simone's new haircut. But every attempt at conversation felt forced, like I was a stranger intruding on a family gathering. When it was time for cake, Morella brought out a store-bought chocolate cake with candles. Everyone sang happy birthday. She made a wish, blew out the candles, and smiled. But when she looked at me, the smile didn't reach her eyes. After cake, I excused myself and left early, claiming I was tired. No one tried to stop me. I drove home through the cold February night, tears streaming down my face, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Chapter 10. The Realization. Spring came slowly to Chicago that year. The snow melted in fits and starts, leaving behind gray slush and bare trees. I kept going to book club, kept volunteering, kept painting terrible watercolors. I built routines that had nothing to do with my children, friendships that existed outside of my role as mother and grandmother. And slowly, I started to understand something important. I hadn't lost my family by setting boundaries. I had revealed who they really were when they couldn't take from me anymore. It was Simone who finally said it out loud. She came to visit in early April, showing up at my door unannounced on a Saturday morning. I made coffee, and we sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd spent so many years feeding everyone else. "Mom," she said, her voice soft, "I need to tell you something." I waited, my heart bracing for more disappointment. "You were right," she continued, "about all of it. We've been taking you for granted. I've been thinking about Christmas, about that phone call, about Morella's birthday, and I'm ashamed." Tears welled up in my eyes. "I didn't want to be right," I whispered. "I just wanted to be seen." "I know," she said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "And I see you now. I'm sorry it took me this long." We talked for hours that day. She told me about her own struggles, about feeling caught between her siblings and me, about wanting to fix everything but not knowing how. I told her about the loneliness, about feeling like I'd disappeared in my own life. "What about Morella and Garrett?" I asked finally. Simone's face fell. "Morella's angry. She thinks you're punishing her. Garrett just wants everyone to get along, so he's not really dealing with it." "I don't know if they'll come around, Mom. I hope they will, but I can't promise anything." The truth of her words settled over me like a heavy blanket. Not all stories have happy endings. Not all families heal. Chapter 11. The Letter. In May, I wrote Morella a letter. I didn't send it by email or text. I wrote it by hand, on real paper, because some things deserve that kind of attention. "Dear Morella, I've been thinking a lot about us, about our relationship, about Christmas and your birthday, and all the ways we've hurt each other these past months. I want you to know that I love you. I have always loved you, from the moment I first held you in my arms. Nothing that has happened changes that, but I also want you to understand something. I spent so much of my life making myself small, so that you and your siblings could be big. I gave up my dreams, my time, my energy, making sure you had everything you needed, and I did it gladly, because that's what mothers do. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that I was a person too. Not just your mother, not just Grandma, but Delilah. A woman with her own needs, her own limits, her own worth. When I asked you for help on Christmas, I wasn't trying to punish you or make you feel guilty. I was trying to survive. I was trying to say, I can't keep doing this alone. I understand that my asking for change was uncomfortable. I understand that it's hard to see your parents as anything other than the roles they've always played. But I need you to try. I'm not going back to being invisible. I can't. But I want you in my life, Mirella. I want us to find a new way of being family. One where everyone's needs matter, including mine. I don't know if you're ready for that. And I've made peace with the possibility that you might never be. But I want you to know that the door is always open. Whenever you're ready to walk through it, I'll be here. I love you. Mom. I mailed it and waited. Chapter 12. The Truth About Endings. Mirella never responded to my letter. It's been a year now since that Christmas dinner, and she still hasn't called, hasn't visited, hasn't reached out. The letter sits somewhere in her house, maybe thrown away, maybe tucked in a drawer and forgotten. I'll never know, and I've had to make peace with that uncertainty. Garrett calls occasionally, brief, surface-level conversations about the weather and his kids' activities. He never mentions Mirella, and I've stopped asking. I can hear the discomfort in his voice when the silences stretch too long. His desperate need to smooth everything over without actually addressing what's broken. He's the mediator who can't mediate. The peacekeeper caught in a war he doesn't want to acknowledge exists. Last month, he called on a Tuesday evening, right after my book club meeting. I was still feeling energized from our discussion about a novel set in post-war Italy, still buzzing with the intellectual stimulation of analyzing themes and characters with women who actually listened to what I had to say. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying that familiar cautious tone. "The kids are asking about you. They want to know when Grandma's coming to visit." My heart clenched. I missed my grandchildren terribly, missed their laughter, their hugs, their innocent joy. But I also knew what he was really asking. "They can come visit me any time," I said gently. "You know where I live." A pause. Then carefully. "It's just that it's easier if you come here. You know, with their schedules and everything." "Garrett," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I love those children. But I'm not going to drive 2 hours to be treated like a servant in my own son's house. If they want to see me, I'm here. The door is open. But I'm not chasing people who don't want to meet me halfway." He sighed, that long-suffering sigh that told me I was being difficult again. "Okay, Mom, I'll tell them." He hasn't called since. Simone comes by once a month, sometimes more. She's the only one who made the choice to see me differently, and I'm grateful for that, even though it's bittersweet. She brings her boyfriend, Marcus, a kind man who works as a teacher in Seattle. They talk about their lives, their plans, their dreams of maybe starting a family someday. Last week, they came for Sunday brunch. I made quiche and fresh fruit salad, and we sat in my sunny kitchen, the three of us, talking and laughing like real people, like equals. Marcus asked about my painting class, genuinely interested in what I was learning. Simone showed me photos from their recent trip to the Oregon coast. Before they left, Simone hugged me tight and whispered in my ear, "I'm proud of you, Mom. I know this is hard, but you're doing the right thing." I held on to her, fighting back tears, because sometimes the smallest validations mean everything. After they left, I sat in my living room as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I'd lost and what I'd gained. I'm 71 now, and my life looks nothing like I thought it would at this age. When Theodore and I used to talk about retirement, about growing old together, we'd paint these pictures of being surrounded by family. Grandchildren running through the house, big holiday dinners with everyone gathered around the table, family vacations to national parks, that Norman Rockwell fantasy of multi-generational togetherness. He died before we could have any of that, and I'd spent the last 15 years trying to create that vision on my own, trying to force a fantasy into reality through sheer determination and endless service. But fantasies don't work that way. You can't cook and clean and sacrifice your way into being valued. You can't make people see you by making yourself invisible. I understand that now. I'm not surrounded by grandchildren and family dinners. I don't host holidays. I don't spend my days in the kitchen, preparing meals for people who have forgotten to thank me. Instead, I spend my Tuesdays at book club, where 8 women treat me like an intellectual equal, where my opinions matter, where I'm Delilah, not just somebody's mother. We've read 12 books together this year, everything from contemporary fiction to classic literature, and every discussion leaves me feeling energized and alive. I volunteer on Thursdays at the soup kitchen downtown, There's a regular there, a man named Jerome who used to be a jazz musician before addiction took everything from him. He's been sober for 6 months now, and every week he thanks me for the meal, looks me in the eye, and asks how I'm doing. Really asks, like he cares about the answer. Last week, he brought his saxophone and played for us during the lunch service. The sound of that music, sad and beautiful and real, made me cry in the best way. I paint on Saturday mornings at the community center, terrible watercolors that I hang on my own walls because they make me smile. My teacher, a patient woman named Ruth who's about my age, told me last week that I'm improving, that she can see me finding my own style. I don't know if she was just being kind, but it felt good to hear anyway. I have lunch with Florence and her friends once a week. There are 5 of us now, all women in our 60s and 70s, all of us learning to build lives that belong to us. We call ourselves the Renaissance Women, half joking but also serious about this idea of rediscovering ourselves in the final chapters of our lives. Florence lost her husband 10 years ago, and her daughter barely speaks to her. Margaret's son moved to Australia and visits once every 3 years if she's lucky. Patricia's children put her in a nursing home against her will, and she fought her way out and now lives in a tiny apartment with a cat named Resistance. We're a collection of women who've been discarded or diminished by the people we sacrificed everything for, and together we're creating something new. Last month, we took a trip to Michigan, rented a cabin on a lake, and spent 4 days reading, talking, and watching the sunset over the water. It was one of the best weekends of my life. I take walks by the lake when the weather's nice. Long walks where I can think and breathe and exist without anyone needing anything from me. I watch the waves, the seagulls, the other people passing by with their dogs and their strollers and their own complicated lives. I read poetry again, like I did when I was young and full of dreams. I've been working my way through Mary Oliver, and there's one line that keeps echoing in my head. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? For 70 years, my answer would have been, I plan to give it away to everyone else. Now, finally, I'm learning a different answer. I'm not invisible anymore, but I'm also alone in ways I never expected. And that's the truth that no one tells you about setting boundaries, about demanding to be seen. Sometimes, the people you love choose not to see you anyway. Sometimes, they walk away rather than change. Sometimes, they'd rather lose you than adjust their expectations, and you have to let them. There are days when I miss the chaos, the noise, the feeling of being needed. I'll hear a child's laughter on the street and think of my grandchildren, wonder what they're doing, if they think about me, if they understand why Grandma isn't around anymore. I'll see a family at a restaurant, 3 generations gathered around a table, and feel a sharp stab of envy mixed with grief. There are days when I look at the empty chairs around my table and feel the loss like a physical ache. This table that used to groan under the weight of food and family now holds just my breakfast dishes, my library books, my watercolor supplies. The silence in this house can be deafening. I had a particularly hard day last month. It was Morella's daughter's birthday. My granddaughter Emma, who would have turned 16. I remembered her birth, remembered holding that tiny baby, and feeling my heart expand in ways I didn't think possible. I'd imagined being part of all her milestones, helping her learn to drive, giving her advice about boys and college and life. Instead, I wasn't invited to her party. I found out about it through a photo on social media that Garrett had posted. I saw my whole family there, 3 generations gathered together, and I wasn't in a single picture. It was like I'd been erased. I cried that day. I let myself feel the full weight of what I'd lost, the relationships that had crumbled, the family that had chosen to close ranks without me. I let myself grieve the grandmother I'd wanted to be, and the family I'd wanted to have. But then I called Florence, and she came over with a bottle of wine and her wisdom, and she reminded me of something important. Delilah, she said, sitting across from me in my living room, you didn't lose them. They lost you. There's a difference. You're still here, still whole, still valuable. They're the ones who chose to walk away from that. She was right, but it didn't make it hurt less. The thing about grief is that it doesn't follow a straight line. Some days, I wake up feeling strong and certain, proud of the life I've built for myself. Other days, I wake up feeling the weight of what I've sacrificed to have this freedom, wondering if it was worth it. wondering if I should have just kept my mouth shut and stayed in the kitchen. But then I remember Christmas night, remember standing at that sink with my hands in dishwater, while my family laughed without me. I remember that feeling of invisibility, of being useful but not valued, of existing only as a function and not as a person, and I know I can never go back to that. There are also days, more and more often now, when I look in the mirror and recognize the woman staring back at me. Days when I feel proud of what I've built for myself, this small, quiet life that belongs to me and no one else. I saw a therapist for a few months after Christmas, something I'd never done before. Dr. Hannah Chen, a woman in her 50s who specialized in helping people navigate family dynamics and life transitions. She told me something in one of our sessions that I think about often. "Delilah," she said, leaning forward in her chair, "you spent 70 years conditioning your family to see you a certain way. You taught them that you would always be available, always accommodating, always willing to sacrifice yourself. And then you changed the rules. Of course they're upset. You disrupted their entire understanding of who you are and what they could expect from you. But their discomfort doesn't mean you were wrong. It just means change is hard, especially for the people who benefited from the old system." That helped. Understanding that my children's rejection wasn't really about me, but about their own inability to adapt, to see me as a full person rather than just a role. It didn't take away the pain, but it helped me carry it differently. I've also learned something else this year, something unexpected. I've learned that there are different kinds of family. The Renaissance women have become my sisters in ways my actual family never was. We show up for each other. When Margaret had pneumonia, we took turns bringing her soup and keeping her company. When Patricia's cat died, we held a memorial service that was both ridiculous and beautiful. When Florence fell and broke her hip, we organized a rotation to help with her recovery. These women see me. They value me. They chose me, and I chose them. And that choice makes our connection more precious than blood ever could. The lesson I've learned, the one I wish I'd understood decades ago, is this: you cannot love people into seeing you. You cannot sacrifice yourself into mattering. You cannot earn respect by giving everything away. And sometimes, the people you've given everything to will choose their comfort over your dignity. When that happens, you have two choices. You can make yourself small again, disappear back into the kitchen, pretend everything is fine, accept crumbs of attention and call it love. Or you can stand in your truth, even if it means standing alone. You can demand to be seen, to be valued, to be treated as a whole person with needs and limits and worth. I chose to stand. And while I grieve the family I thought I'd have, while I mourn the relationships that couldn't survive my asking to be treated with respect, I also know something now that I didn't know before. I am enough, just as I am. Not as someone's mother, not as someone's grandmother, not as the woman in the kitchen making sure everyone else is fed and happy, just as Delilah, as a woman who reads poetry and paints watercolors and volunteers and has friends and opinions and dreams that have nothing to do with anyone else. I am enough. That cold Christmas dinner taught me that the most important table I need a seat at is my own. And at my table, I'm always welcome. I'm never invisible. I'm never taken for granted. I matter because I exist, not because of what I can provide to others. Is this the ending I wanted? No. If I could wave a magic wand and have my family recognize my worth, embrace the boundaries I've set, and build new, healthier relationships with me, I would do it in a heartbeat. But I can't control other people. I can only control myself. And I choose to live with dignity, even if that means living with loneliness too. Last week, I was painting in my kitchen, working on a landscape of the lake at sunset, when I realized something. I was happy. Not the performative happiness I'd shown my family for years, the smile through the exhaustion happiness, but real happiness. The kind that comes from being exactly where you are, doing exactly what you want to do, with no one demanding anything else from you. It was a quiet happiness, tinged with sadness for what I'd lost, but it was real. And maybe that's what this final chapter of my life is about. Not the loud, messy, complicated happiness of family and grandchildren and holiday dinners, but the quiet, solid happiness of knowing yourself, of living authentically, of refusing to be invisible even when the cost is high. I'm 71 years old, and I finally understand what it means to live for myself. Not in a selfish way, but in a necessary way, in a survival way. I don't know if Morella will ever read my letter, ever understand what I was trying to tell her. I don't know if Garrett will ever stop trying to smooth everything over and actually address the problem. I don't know if I'll ever have the relationship with my grandchildren that I always dreamed of, but I do know this. I will not go back to being invisible. I will not spend whatever years I have left serving people who can't be bothered to see me as a person. I will paint my terrible watercolors and read my poetry, and volunteer at the soup kitchen, and take walks by the lake, and laugh with my friends and live my one wild and precious life on my own terms. And if that means I do it alone, then I do it alone. Because loneliness with dignity is better than company with invisibility. That's the truth I wish I'd known 70 years ago. That's the truth I'm finally living now. The cold dinner is long past. The lesson has been learned. And I'm still here, still standing, still Delilah. That's enough. It has to be. The end. Epilogue. 2 years later, the autumn air in Chicago carried that particular crispness that always reminded me of new beginnings. Strange, how fall had become my favorite season, when for so many years it had meant the anxious preparation for holiday gatherings, the countdown to Christmas dinners and Thanksgiving chaos. Now, at 73, I walked through the falling leaves in Lincoln Park, without that familiar knot of dread in my stomach. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I'd just finished my volunteer shift at the soup kitchen. Jerome had played his saxophone again today, a haunting rendition of Georgia on My Mind that had made several people cry, including me. He'd been sober for 2.5 years now, and had recently gotten a small apartment. Last week, he'd brought me a watercolor set as a thank you gift, a beautiful set of professional-grade paints that must have cost him more than he could afford. "And you kept showing up for me when nobody else would," he'd said, pressing the box into my hands. "Figure it's time I show up for your dreams too." I'd cried then as well, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of being seen, being valued, by someone who owed me nothing and chose to give me everything anyway. As I walk through the park now, that watercolor set tucked carefully in my bag, I thought about how much my life had transformed in these 2 years, how the woman who'd stood alone in that kitchen on Christmas night, invisible and aching, had become someone I actually recognized in the mirror. The Renaissance women had grown to 7 now. We'd added 2 more members. Diane, whose husband had left her for a younger woman after 40 years of marriage, and Yolanda, whose adult children had systematically stolen her inheritance and then abandoned her when the money ran out. We met twice a week now, once for lunch, and once for what we called our salon evenings, where we'd gather at someone's house, drink wine, and discuss everything from politics to philosophy to our own complicated relationships with aging and loss. Last month, we'd taken a trip to New Orleans. 7 women in their 60s and 70s, riding the streetcars, eating beignets at Café du Monde, listening to jazz on Frenchman Street until midnight. We'd laughed until our sides hurt, danced in ways our bodies protested the next day, and felt young and alive and free in ways that had nothing to do with denying our age and everything to do with embracing it. Florence had pulled me aside one night as we walked back to our hotel, the humid Louisiana air wrapping around us like a warm blanket. "You know what I love about us," she'd said, slightly tipsy on bourbon and joy. "We're not trying to recapture our youth. We're not pretending we're something we're not. We're just finally allowing ourselves to be who we actually are, without apologizing for it." She was right. That was exactly what we were doing. And it was glorious. My painting had improved significantly. Ruth, my teacher, had encouraged me to enter a piece in a local art show for amateur artists. And to my absolute shock, I'd won 3rd place. The painting hung in my living room now, a watercolor of the lake at sunset. All purples and oranges and that particular quality of light that exists only in the transition between day and night. When I'd won, when they'd called my name and I'd walked up to accept that small ribbon and certificate, I'd felt something I hadn't felt in decades, pride in myself that had nothing to do with anyone else's accomplishments or needs. Just pure, uncomplicated pride in something I had created, something that was entirely mine. I'd called Simone immediately after the ceremony, and she'd screamed with joy over the phone, telling Marcus, and I could hear him cheering in the background. They'd driven down from Seattle the following weekend, specifically to see the painting in person, to take me out to dinner to celebrate to make me feel like this accomplishment mattered, because it did matter. Not because it was a particularly amazing painting, or because the competition was especially prestigious, but because it represented something larger, my willingness to try something new, to be vulnerable, to create something for no other reason than because I wanted to. Book club had become the intellectual anchor of my week. We'd read 24 books over the past year, and our discussions had grown deeper, more nuanced, more challenging. Last month we'd read The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, and the discussion about Stevens, the butler who'd sacrificed everything for a version of dignity that left him ultimately empty, had hit uncomfortably close to home. That was me, I'd said to the group, my voice shaking. I was Stevens, spending my whole life serving, thinking that perfect service was the same thing as having worth, and by the time I realized it wasn't, I'd lost decades I could never get back. Margaret had reached over and squeezed my hand. But you're not him anymore, Delilah. Stevens ends the book still trapped in his delusions. You broke free. That's the difference. I'd held on to those words for days afterward. The soup kitchen had expanded my world in unexpected ways. Beyond Jerome, I'd gotten to know dozens of people whose stories had reshaped my understanding of poverty, addiction, mental illness, and the 1,000 ways life could break a person through no fault of their own. There was Sandra, a woman my age who'd been a successful accountant until her husband's medical bills bankrupted them, and she'd lost everything. There was Marcus, different from Simone's Marcus, a veteran with PTSD who'd been living in his car for 3 years. There was Yolanda, different from our Yolanda, a transgender woman who'd been kicked out by her family at 50 and was slowly rebuilding her life from nothing. These people had taught me more about resilience, about dignity in the face of impossible circumstances, than I'd learned in all my years of comfortable middle-class existence. And they'd taught me something else too, that being of service, truly being of service, looked nothing like what I'd been doing for my family all those years. Real service was mutual. It was about showing up as an equal, recognizing the full humanity of the person you were helping, allowing yourself to be changed by the encounter. What I'd been doing in my family wasn't service. It was self-erasure. There was a difference. An understanding that difference had changed everything. My relationship with Simone had deepened into something beautiful and complicated and real. She called me every week, sometimes just to talk about her day, sometimes to ask advice, sometimes to check in on me. But it wasn't the one-sided checking in I'd experienced with my other children. That obligatory, "How are you, Mom?" followed by a quick subject change. Simone actually listened. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered details from previous conversations. Last month, she'd told me she and Marcus were engaged. They'd called me together on a video chat, both of them beaming, and I'd cried happy tears, genuinely happy in a way I hadn't been sure I could still feel about family milestones. "We want you involved in the wedding planning," Simone had said. "Not to do the work, but to be part of it, to celebrate with us. Will you help me choose a dress? Will you be there?" "Of course," I'd said. My heart so full it hurt. I wouldn't miss it for the world. They were planning a small ceremony in Seattle next spring. Just close friends and family. Simone had been clear that Morella and Garrett would be invited, but that if they couldn't be respectful to me, they wouldn't be welcome. "This is my wedding," she'd said firmly, "and I'm not having my mother treated like she doesn't matter at my own celebration. They can get on board or they can stay home." I'd tried to tell her she didn't have to do that I didn't want to be the cause of family drama on her special day, but she'd cut me off. "Mom, you're not the cause. Their inability to treat you with basic respect is the cause. There's a difference. And I'm done pretending there isn't." Hearing my own words, my own boundaries, reflected back to me through my daughter, had been one of the most validating experiences of my life. Garrett had called twice in the past 2 years. Both times had been brief, awkward conversations where he danced around anything meaningful, talking about weather and work and surface-level updates about his children. I'd tried to go deeper, to ask real questions, to connect, but he'd deflected every time. The second call had ended with him saying, "You know, Mom, you could make this easier if you just apologize to Morella. She's really hurt, and I think if you just said you were sorry, we could all move past this." I'd felt that old familiar pull, that desperate desire to smooth things over, to make everyone happy, to fix everything by making myself smaller. But then I'd remembered Christmas night. I'd remembered 2 years of slowly rebuilding my sense of self, and I'd said, as gently as I could, "Garrett, I'm not going to apologize for asking to be treated with respect. I love you, and I love Morella, and the door is always open, but I'm not going to lie and say I was wrong when I wasn't." He hadn't called since. Morella remained silent, complete radio silence. No returned calls, no acknowledgement of birthday cards I sent, no response to the letter I'd written, or the follow-up letter I'd sent 6 months later. It was like I'd died, like she'd simply erased me from her life and moved on. That hurt in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Of all my children, Morella had been the one I'd been closest to when she was young. We'd had a special bond, or so I'd thought. She'd been my first baby, the one who'd turned me into a mother, the one I'd poured so much of myself into. Losing her felt like losing a limb. Some days I could barely feel it, the phantom pain just a distant ache. Other days it was all I could feel, this gaping absence where my daughter used to be. Dr. Chen, my therapist, whom I still saw monthly, had helped me process this grief. She'd explained that sometimes the people who benefit most from an unhealthy dynamic are the ones who fight hardest against changing it. Morella had been the oldest, the one who'd gotten the most from me, the most years of my undivided attention, the most sacrifice. Of course she was the angriest about losing that. It doesn't make it hurt less, Dr. Chen had said during one session, but understanding the psychology might help you stop blaming yourself. This isn't about you being a bad mother. This is about her being unable to see you as anything other than the role she needs you to play. I'd worked hard not to blame myself, but some days it was impossible not to wonder, had I been too harsh, too demanding? Should I have been more patient, given them more time to adjust? Should I have swallowed my pride and my pain and just accepted that this was how things were? But then I'd talk to Florence or the other Renaissance women who'd all faced similar rejections from their families, and they'd remind me of the truth. You cannot set yourself on fire to keep others warm. You cannot sacrifice your dignity for someone else's comfort. And if people choose to walk away, rather than adjust to your boundaries, that's their choice, not your failure. Still, the grief remained. Grief for the relationship I'd wanted, for the grandmother I'd hoped to be to Morella's children, for the family gatherings that would never happen, for the mother-daughter bond that had crumbled under the weight of a single request. Please see me. 3 months ago, something unexpected happened. I'd been at the grocery store, loading bags into my car, when I heard a small voice say, "Grandma." I'd turned around and found myself staring at Emma, Morella's daughter, now 17 years old. She'd grown so much, transformed from the girl I remembered into this young woman with her mother's eyes and her grandmother's chin. She was standing there in the parking lot, looking nervous and hopeful and uncertain. "Emma," I'd breathed, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I've been wanting to talk to you," she'd said quickly, like she was afraid she'd lose her nerve. "Mom doesn't know I'm here. She'd be furious if she found out. But I had to see you. I had to tell you. I miss you, Grandma." We'd gone to a coffee shop, somewhere far from Morella's neighborhood, and we'd talked for 2 hours. Emma had told me everything. How Morella had painted me as the villain, how she'd told the kids that I'd chosen to abandon the family, that I'd hurt her terribly and refused to apologize, how Emma had believed it at first, but as she'd gotten older, as she'd started to see how her mother treated other people, how she demanded things without giving anything back, she'd started to question the narrative. "I found your letter," Emma had said, her eyes filling with tears. "Mom had thrown it in a drawer in her office. I read it, Grandma, and I realized you weren't asking for anything unreasonable. You were just asking to be treated like a person." Hearing that, hearing my granddaughter understand what her mother couldn't, had broken something open inside me. I'd cried right there in the coffee shop, and Emma had cried too, and we'd held hands across the table like lifelines. We'd been meeting secretly every few weeks since then. She'd come to my house, see my paintings, meet Florence, and some of the other Renaissance women. She'd told me about school, about her plans to study social work in college, about the boy she was dating, and her complicated relationship with her mother. "And she's not happy," Emma had said during one visit. She's angry all the time. Nothing's ever good enough. Dad tries to keep the peace, but it's like walking on eggshells constantly. And I watch her, and I think, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to end up bitter and angry because I can't let people be who they are." I'd wanted to defend Morella, to make excuses, but Emma had looked at me with such clear-eyed honesty that I couldn't do it. "Your mother is dealing with her own pain," I'd said carefully. "Her own issues that have nothing to do with you. But Emma, you're right. You don't have to repeat her patterns. You can choose differently. Like you did, she'd said. You chose differently, even though it cost you everything. Not everything, I'd thought. It hadn't cost me everything, just the illusion of everything. Having Emma back in my life, even secretly, even in this limited way, had been both a blessing and a fresh wound. It reminded me of everything I was missing with my other grandchildren, all the moments I wasn't part of, all the growing up I wasn't witnessing, but it also gave me hope. Hope that maybe, eventually, some of them would understand, that maybe the work I was doing now, the boundary setting and self-respect modeling, might plant seeds that would bloom in the next generation. Last week, Emma had asked me something that had kept me awake for nights afterward. "Grandma," she'd said, sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where this had all started. "Do you regret it? Standing up for yourself? Because I know it's been hard. I know you've lost a lot. Do you ever wish you just kept things the way they were?" I'd thought about it for a long time before answering. Really thought about it. Didn't just give her the easy, inspirational response. "Some days," I'd said honestly. "Some days I wake up and the house is quiet and I think about what it would be like to have everyone here, to hear children's laughter, to be part of the chaos again. And I wonder if my pride was worth this loneliness. But then I remember what that chaos actually felt like, how invisible I was, how much of myself I'd erased to maintain the illusion of a happy family. And I realize I was lonely then too. More lonely, actually, because I was surrounded by people who couldn't see me. I'd paused, making sure she understood. Now I'm alone sometimes, yes, but I'm not lonely in the same way, because the people in my life now, they see me, really see me, and that matters more than I can explain. So no, Emma, I don't regret it. I regret that it had to happen this way. I regret that your mother and I couldn't find a way through this together, but I don't regret refusing to be invisible anymore." Emma had nodded, understanding in a way that made me hope for her future, hope that she'd never have to learn this lesson the way I did. Now, walking through the park on this crisp October afternoon, I found myself thinking about legacy, about what I was leaving behind, what my life actually meant in the grand scheme of things. I wouldn't leave behind memories of perfect family holidays. I wouldn't be remembered as the grandmother who was always there, always available, always sacrificing. My obituary wouldn't read like those Facebook posts celebrating selfless mothers who gave everything to their families. But maybe that was okay. Maybe that was even better. Because what I would leave behind was this, the example of a woman who chose herself, who set boundaries even when it hurt, who rebuilt her life at 70 and found joy and purpose and friendship and art and meaning outside of her role as someone's mother or grandmother. I'd leave behind Emma's understanding that she didn't have to repeat the patterns of her mother. I'd leave behind Simone's example of what it looked like to maintain a real, mutual, respectful relationship with a parent. I'd leave behind the impact I'd had on Jerome and Sandra and all the people at the soup kitchen who'd told me I made them feel human, feel valued, feel seen. I'd leave behind paintings and friendships and stories and this quiet, dignified life I'd built from the ashes of the old one. That was my legacy. Not perfect, not what I'd planned, but real, honest, mine. As I reached the edge of the park, my phone buzzed. A text from Florence. "Salon night at my place. Bring that new painting you've been working on. And wine, lots of wine. Patricia has announced she's dating a man she met at the library, and we need to thoroughly investigate this development." I smiled, typing back a response, feeling that warm sense of anticipation. My people, my chosen family, my Thursday evening plans that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with joy. Another text came through, this one from Simone. "Mom, I found the most beautiful venues for the reception. Can you video chat this weekend to look at them with me? I want your input. Your input, not your work, not your service. Your input. Because what I thought mattered. Because I was part of this as a person, not just a function." I walked toward my car, the autumn sun warm on my face, my bag full of professional-grade watercolors that Jerome had given me because he saw my dreams as worthy of investment. In a few hours, I'd be sitting in Florence's living room with women who understood me, celebrating Patricia's unexpected romance, drinking wine, showing off my latest painting, being fully myself without apology. This weekend, I'd video chat with my daughter about wedding venues, and she'd listen to my opinions and we'd laugh together, and it would be easy and real and mutual. Next week, I'd volunteer at the soup kitchen, and Jerome would play his saxophone, and I'd serve meals to people who thanked me and saw me and reminded me that true service was about mutual humanity, not self-erasure. Next month, the Renaissance women would plan another trip, maybe to the Smoky Mountains or New England or somewhere else we'd never been but always wanted to see. We'd be 7 women in our 60s and 70s, living our lives on our own terms, refusing to disappear just because the world expected us to. Was this the life I'd imagined at 73? No. Was it the life I'd wanted when I was young, when I was first married, when I was holding my babies and dreaming of the future? No, but it was a good life, a real life, an honest life. It was mine. And standing there in that parking lot, the autumn leaves swirling around my feet, the sun painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, I realized something that felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for 2 years. I wasn't incomplete without Marilla and Garrett. I wasn't broken because my family had fractured. I wasn't less than because I'd chosen dignity over dysfunction. I was whole, exactly as I was, with my paintings and my book club and my volunteer work and my Renaissance women and my secret coffee dates with Emma and my real, mutual relationship with Simone, with my quiet house and my purposeful days and my hard-won sense of self. I was whole. The grief was still there. It would always be there, I suspected, a scar where something important used to be. Some losses don't heal completely. They just become part of who you are. But grief and wholeness could coexist. Loss and joy could sit side by side. You could mourn what didn't work out and still celebrate what did. You could miss the family you'd hoped for and still appreciate the life you'd built instead. That was the final lesson, the one that had taken me 2 years and 73 years to learn. You don't have to choose between grieving your losses and celebrating your gains. You don't have to be okay with everything to be okay overall. You can hold both, the sadness and the joy, the regret and the pride, the loneliness and the connection. You can hold both and still be whole. I got into my car, placed my bag carefully on the passenger seat, and started the engine. As I drove through the Chicago streets toward home, toward my evening with friends, toward whatever came next, I thought about that cold Christmas dinner 2 years ago. That woman standing alone in the kitchen, invisible and aching, had thought she was at her breaking point. She'd thought that asking to be seen was the risk of a lifetime, that demanding respect might cost her everything. She'd been right. It had cost her a lot. More than she'd anticipated. More than she'd wanted to pay. But it had also given her something she'd never had before. Herself. And driving through the city on that beautiful autumn afternoon, surrounded by the life I'd built and the people who'd chosen to be part of it, I understood that the trade had been worth it. Not easy, not painless, not perfect, but worth it. I was Delilah Winters. I was 73 years old. I was an amateur painter and a volunteer and a friend and a mother and a grandmother and, most importantly, myself. I was not invisible. I was not small. I was not less than. I was whole. And I was finally home. Not the home I'd planned for or expected or dreamed about when I was young, but home nonetheless. My home. My life. My terms. That cold Christmas dinner had taught me that the most important table I needed a seat at was my own. And at my table, I would always be welcome. At my table, I would always be seen. At my table, I would always matter. Because I'd finally learned what should have been obvious all along. I was the one who decided my own worth. Not my children. Not my family. Not anyone else. Me. And I decided that I was enough. Just as I was. With all my losses and gains, my grief and joy, my scars and healing, I was enough. The autumn light slanted through my windshield, golden and warm, and I smiled. I was enough. And that was everything. The end.